Three-way Anova followed by post-hoc test in SPSS Jamovi and GraphPad Prism. Three-way Anova followed by post-hoc test in SPSS. Three-way Anova is factorial Anova. The test is used when there are three different factors or three different independent variables and one dependent variable. Here in this SPSS data view, I had inserted a data. There are three factors or three independent variables and one dependent variable. The three factors are: the first one, the job factor, which have 4 levels in it: doctor, dentist, pharmacist, and nurses. So there are 4 groups or 4 categories in this factor. The second factor is the qualification factor for PhD. The PhD factor have 2 levels. Either you have a PhD or no PhD. So there are 2 categories. The third factor is the gender factor, and it have 2 levels in it, male or female. So there are 2 groups. The dependent variable, which is the salary, is the wages earned by individual per year in pounds. So this dependent variable is a continuous variable. For this data, we have 3 factors: job, PhD, gender, and one dependent variable, which is the salary. To find out whether there is a difference between the salary earned by doctors, dentists, pharmacists, and nurses, and whether there is a difference in the salary earned based on factor 2, which is having a PhD or no PhD, and to find out whether there is a difference in the salary based on the gender, whether you are a male or a female. Three-way Anova statistical test will be performed. The test will examine whether there is a difference among the levels for factor 1, and whether there is a difference among the levels within factor 2, and whether there is a difference in the level among factor 3, which is the gender, based on the salary. The test also will examine whether there is an interaction between different factors that might have an effect on the salary. To perform the three-way Anova, 7 hypotheses will be generated. The first null hypothesis states that there is no differences in the means among the levels in factor number 1. The second null hypothesis states that there is no differences in the mean for factor 2 in terms of the salary. The third null hypothesis states that there is no differences in the mean for factor 3, and the fourth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor 1 and factor 2. The fifth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor 1 and factor 3, and the sixth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor 2 and factor 3, and the seventh null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor 1 and factor 2 and factor 3 and they have no effect on the salary earned. To do the analysis, click on Analyze, scroll down to General Linear Model, and then click on Univariate. In this window here, move the salary into the dependent variable and the job and the PhD and the gender into the fixed factors. Click on Plots, move the job into the horizontal axis, click on Add the PhD into a horizontal axis, click on Add, and the gender into a horizontal axis, click on Add. Then select the job, move it to horizontal axis, PhD into separate line, Add, and then job again into horizontal, gender into separate, and then Add, and then PhD into horizontal and gender into separate, then Add, and then select the job finally into the horizontal, PhD into separate, and gender into separate plots. Click on Ads. Now we have plots for all possible combination of interaction. Click on Continue, click on Post Hoc. Since there are 4 levels in the factor for job, post hoc test will be done for that. There is no point of choosing post hoc test for gender and PhD, as both of them are binomial. They only have 2 categories in them. Click on Tucky here, choose the Tucky post hoc test, click on Continue. Post hoc test will look for all possible combination and pairwise between 2 groups and determine whether there is a difference in the mean and whether there is a significant difference between these 2 groups within the job factor. Click on estimated marginal means and select all the factors here and all the factors and factor interaction, move them to the display means for, and then click on compare main effect, click on OK, and for the click on the save icon and click on unstandardized, click continue. For the options, select the descriptive statistics, homogeneity of test, and estimate of the size effect. Click on continue and then click on OK. The SPSS will generate several tables and plots toward the end. And for the first table, it shows the number of cases included in each factor with its sub-level. As we have here for the job factor 4 levels, and there are 24 participants in each group. PhD 2 levels, and there are 48 participants in each group, and gender 2 groups, male and females, and they have 48 in each group. For the second table, descriptive statistics shows the mean and the standard deviation for the 3 factors combined. As we can see here, job level 1, doctors who have a PhD and who is male, this is their mean salary, and for female, this is their mean salary. And for doctor who have no PhD, this is the mean for the male and the female, and for dentist the same, and pharmacist and nurses. The third table is the Levin's test for equality of variances. Again, the table shows that there is no homogeneity of variances, so there is a heterogeneity of variances, and one of the assumptions for performing 3-way Anova is violated. However, we will continue with the analysis as the Anova is a robust method to perform analysis using it. The next table is the test of between subject effect. This is the table will determine the statistical differences for each individual factor, the main factors, which are the three factors: job, PhD, and gender, and then the interaction between these factors, all possible interactions. So we are going to ignore the first two rows here, corrected model and intercept. For the job factor, there is a significant differences in terms of the salary earned among the four different groups: doctors, dentists, pharmacists, and nurses. For the PhD factor, there is again a significant difference in the salary earned for those who have a PhD compared to those who do not have a PhD. However, for the third factor, which is the gender, it shows that there is no differences in the salary, or no differences in the mean of the salary earned between those who are males or females. So the gender have no effect on the amount of money earned annually. The interaction between job and PhD indicate that there is a significant differences on the salary earned. However, job and gender have no significant difference, and there is no interaction and there is no effect on the salary earned. PhD and gender, again, there is no significant differences between PhD and gender. For the final interaction, which is job, PhD, and gender, again, there is no significant differences, which indicate that interaction between these three factors have no influences on the salary earned. The other tables are just subgroups for the all different factors and interactions. This table shows that the pairwise comparison using Hoc Test, since we have four levels in that factor: doctor, dentist, pharmacists, and nurses, and the test will combine and test pairwise groups to find whether there is a significant differences between doctor and dentist, or doctor and pharmacists, or doctor and nurses. The analysis here shows that there is a significant difference. If we scroll down toward the end, the first plot shows the job and the salary earned, the mean salary earned. As we can see here, that doctor have the highest salary and nurses the lowest salary. The second plot shows that those who have a PhD tend to have higher salary than those who without a PhD. The other graph shows here factor interaction between factor, jobs, and PhDs, and we can see from this plot that those who have a PhD have a higher salary compared to those who do not have a PhD. Here, whether they are doctor or dentist or pharmacist or nurses. The next plot shows that gender have no influences on the salary earned. And finally, interaction between having a PhD and a job, and whether you are a male or a female. And it shows here that PhD have those who have a PhD have higher salary compared to those who do not have, and similarly the female. So this indicates that gender have no influence on the salary earned. So this is the way to perform three-way Anova statistical test analysis in SPSS. Three-way Anova followed by post-hoc test in Jamovi. Three-way Anova is factorial Anova. And the three-way Anova statistical test is used when there are three different factors or three independent variables and one dependent variable. Here in the Jamovi data view, I had inserted data for 96 cases. There are 3 different factors or 3 different independent variables. The first one is the job, the second one is the PhD, and the third one is the gender, and a fourth variable which is the dependent variable. The first factor is the job factor or occupation. This factor have 4 levels in it, or 4 groups or 4 categories: doctor, dentist, pharmacist, and nurses. In the second factor, which is the PhD factor, there are 2 levels, whether you have a PhD or no PhD. For the third factor, which is the gender, there are 2 levels, male or females. And for the dependent variable, which is the salary, the dependent variable is a continuous variable, which is the wages earned by individuals annually in pounds. To examine and determine whether there is a difference in the salary earned among the levels in factor 1, the job factor, or whether there is a difference in the salary earned based on whether you have a PhD or not, factor 2, or whether there is a difference in the wages earned based on the sex, whether you are male or a female, for factor 3, then 3-way Anova statistical analysis could be used or performed. The 3-way Anova also will examine, in addition to the main effect of the 3 factors on the salary earned, the test will examine interactions between factors and their effect on the salary earned, whether factor 1 and 2 can have an effect on the salary, or factor 1 and 3, or factor 2 and 3, or factor 1 and 2 and 3 can impact the salary earned. Whether the job factor and the PhD factor can interact to affect the or have an effect on the salary earned, or whether the job factor and the gender factor have an effect on the salary, or the PhD factor and the gender factor have an effect on the salary, or whether the 3 factors, PhD, jobs, and gender, can impact the salary earned. So to do the test, 7 null hypotheses will be generated. The first null hypothesis states that there is no differences in the mean for factor 1. The second hypothesis, null hypothesis, states that there is no differences in the mean for factor 2. And the third null hypothesis states that there is no differences in the mean for factor 3. And the fourth hypothesis address the interaction between variable, independent variable or factor job and factor PhD, states that there is no interaction between factor job and factor PhD. The fifth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between job factor and gender. And for the sixth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor PhD and gender. And finally, for the seventh null hypothesis will state that there is no interaction between factor job, factor PhD, and factor gender to influence the salary earned. To perform the analysis in Jamovi using three-way Anova. Click here on the icon Anova and then select Anova. A new window will appear, and in this we're going to select the salary and move it to the dependent variable, and select the job factor, the PhD and the gender, and move it to the fixed factor. Immediately a Anova table is generated on the right hand side, and as we can see here from the Anova table, a p-value is generated and a f ratio is calculated, and based on the p-value, which will be taken as significant if it is less than 0.05. For the first factor, there is a significant differences in the salary earned among 4 different classes of professions: doctor, dentist, pharmacist, and nurses. For the second factor, which is the PhD factor, there is a statistically significant differences in the salary earned between those who have PhD and those who do not have a PhD. For the third factor, which is the gender factor, there is no significant differences in the salary earned based on your gender. For the interaction between job and PhD, there is a significant differences in the salary earned. For the interaction between job and gender, there is no significant differences. For interaction between PhD and gender, again there is no significant differences. And finally, for the interaction between job, PhD, and gender, there is no statistical significant differences. We could also do more checking here and selection for the model. I've already done this, so I'm going to undo that and move it, and then explain how to select and move interaction into the model term. So click on the job in the components and then drag it to the model terms, the PhD, and then the gender. And then for interaction between job and PhD, select this arrow and then click on interaction. For job and gender, select the arrow here, click on interaction, and for PhD and gender, select the arrow and click on interaction, and for the 3 factors, select and click on interaction. Could also select the assumption checks by selecting homogeneity test, normality test, and QQ plot. Again, in the table here, it shows that there is significant differences, and this states that there is no homogeneity of variances, and the assumptions for one of the assumptions for performing three-way Anova has been violated. However, Anova is a robust test, so we're going to move ahead with the test and the analysis, and keeping in mind that there is one of the assumptions have been violated. For the contrast, I'm not going to select anything. For the post hoc test, we could select the first factor since it have 4 levels in it, and the post hoc test will look at pairwise groups and try to find whether there is a significant differences between them in terms of the salary earned. So since PhD factor have 4 levels, gender and the PhD, both of them are dichotomous, i.e. they have only 2 levels in them, and the p-value has been calculated for that. It's just additional. We could also select post hoc test for the interactions, all these interactions, and move them to here. Again, this will generate several tables and make things more complex, but however we will explain a couple of few tables of these generated post hoc test. For the first job factor, which have 4 levels in it: doctor, dentist, pharmacist, and nurses, the Hoc test is selected here, and from the Hoc test table here, it shows that comparison between doctor and dentist, there is a significant differences in the salary earned. And we compare also the doctor to pharmacist or doctor to nurses, there is a significant differences in the salary earned. So this post hoc test will compare two groups together and determine whether there is a significant differences. For the PhD, it is just only 2 levels in it already calculated, and for the gender, again 2 levels, and it has been already calculated previously. For the interaction, again it will become more complex, but you could go for doctor with PhD and doctor without a PhD and determine the p-value, whether there is a significant or not. And for the interaction between job and gender, the same. Things are getting more complicated. And for PhD and gender, again, table is generated here, and for the interaction between the 3 factors, Hoc test table outcome is generated to determine p-value and differences based on pairwise comparison. We could also select the estimated marginal means and draw some graphs. We'll move the job into the term 1 and then add a new term, and then we select the PhD and add it to term 2, and then for gender for term 3 we could also add a new term and look for the interaction between job and PhD, and move it to that area, and then click add a new term, and then job and gender to generate a plot or a graph. Job and gender here, move it to job and gender, and then PhD and gender into this place here, and then select the 3 interaction and move them into a new term. So we have all possible factors with interaction graphs for the 3 factors. Going to have an output to show marginal mean plots, and if we scroll down here, a graph will be produced for all the requested estimated marginal mean. So the first plot shows jobs and salary. There are 4 levels: doctor, dentist, and pharmacist and nurses. For the PhD, 2 levels, and for gender, 2 levels. And for the second one shows interaction between job and PhD, job and gender, gender and PhD, and then interaction between the job, PhD, and gender. This is the way to perform 3-way statistical Anova analysis in Jamovi when there are 3 different factors or 3 different independent variables and 1 dependent variable that is continuous. Three-way Anova followed by post hoc tests in GraphPad Prism. Three-way Anova is factorial Anova. The test is used when there are 3 different factors or 3 different independent variables and 1 dependent variable. Here in this graph GraphPad Prism data view, I had placed data for salary earned by individual annually in pounds. There are three different factors in this data. The first factor is the job factor, which is here in this case doctor, dentist. The second factor is the gender factor, which is male or female. The third factor is the factor for whether a person have a PhD or not. There are three different factors, three independent variables: job, gender, and PhD, and a fourth variable, which is the dependent variable, which is measurable and continuous, the salary variable. To find out whether there is a difference in the mean for factor job, which is factor 1, or there is a difference in the mean for factor 2, which is the gender factor, or whether there is a difference in the mean for the PhD factor, which is a third independent variable, then three-way Anova or factorial Anova statistical test is the one to perform. In addition to try to finding out whether there is a difference due to the main effect by the three factors, it is also possible to look for interactions between those three factors and whether they have an effect on the wages earned by individual person. Whether there is an interaction between factor job with factor gender, or factor job with factor PhD, or factor gender and PhD, or interaction between the three factor 1 and 2 and 3. To perform three-way Anova or factorial Anova, 7 different null hypotheses and alternative hypotheses will be generated. The first hypothesis, null hypothesis, states that there is no difference in the mean for factor 1, which is the job factor. The second null hypothesis states that there is no difference in the mean for factor gender. The third null hypothesis states that there is no difference in the mean for factor PhD. The fourth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor 1, which is the job, and factor 2, which is the gender. The fifth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor job and factor PhD. And the sixth null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between factor gender and factor PhD. And finally, the seventh null hypothesis states that there is no interaction between the three factors: factor job, factor gender, factor PhD. To do the analysis in Prism, click on the Analyze icon here. A window will appear and the software will automatically recognize the setting of this data as three-way Anova, and it will select the three-way Anova testing, and as shown here, analyze doctor male, doctor female, dentist male and female. Click on OK. Another window will appear. Since these data are not repetitive data, so we are not going to select anything in the repeated measure design nor in the repeated measure analysis. since this data are factorial data that have 3 different factors, and we're going to select here the options for changing the factor name. For the first factor, going to change that into doctor versus dentist, and for the second factor it's going to be gender, which is male versus female, and for the row, which is the third factor, is the PhD versus no PhD. For multiple comparisons, it will get here a little bit complicated, and I'm going to select compare the mean of the cell that differ by only 1 factor, and for the options select the correct for multiple comparison using SIDAC method, and here I'm going to generate a graph confidence interval and show cell means additional result. And for the residual, select the heterogeneity plot, the residual plot, and the normality plot. And for consolidate data, I'm not going to select anything. Click on OK. Several windows and sections will appear here. The first one is the outcome for the analysis of 3-way Anova, showing the result, and you can see here that alpha is set up as 0.05. Anything less than 0.05, then that is significant. And for the Anova table here, it shows that whether there is a significant or no significant for the 3 main effects and the interactions. So if we look at the Anova table here, you can see that the factor, which is the PhD, comparing whether there is an effect of having a PhD on the salary earned, those who have a PhD and those who do not have a PhD. Yes, there is a significant difference on those groups or those 2 levels. So there is a difference in the salary earned based on the qualification of having a PhD. For the second factor, which is the factor for job, dentist and doctors, again there is a difference in the salary earned for doctors compared to dentists, and the p-value is significant. And the third factor, which is the gender factor, male and female, again there is no significant differences here on the salary earned. So whether you are a male or a female does not have an influence on the salary earned. For then the interaction between those 3 different factors, the first interaction look at whether the PhD factor and the job factor interact with each other to affect the salary earned. Again here it shows that there is no interaction between those 2 factors. And for the interaction between the PhD and the gender, again there is no significant p-value. There is no interaction between those 2 factors. And for the factor of the job and the factor of the gender, there is no interaction. And for the 3 factors, interaction between the 3 factors, there is no significant interaction between them. And again here the test also will look at the normality test using different statistical tests here, and it shows that these variables data has passed the normality test. For multiple comparison, it will get a little bit complicated for those who are interested in looking at whether there is a difference in comparison between pairwise group and subgroup, then this one is the way to look at. And for the means, I've requested the data here is given, an output is given for the male and female to compare male, female, PhD, doctor and PhD, and doctor and gender. If we look at the graph also, certain different graphs are generated in GraphPad Prism. And for homogeneity of variance, again, it shows this plot, and for QQ plot, graph is generated. So this is the way to perform three-way Anova statistical test in GraphPad Prism.